Hi, I'm Thomas from Neuzeit Instruments, artist name is Hutenberger, and this is part 4 of my tutorial series on how I perform electronic music live. In this part of the series, I will explain how I took the techniques from playing in a jazz combo to electronic music and how I managed to compose music live on stage. I will also talk about my experiences over the last few years performing on stage with electronic instruments and share some real-life tips and tricks with you. So have fun with this episode. So yes, as a musician and former bass guitarist, there was a time in my late teens when I played in a jazz combo with about 8 other musicians who were all very talented guys. Those were probably the most fun gigs I ever played as a band member. The principles of playing in a jazz combo are also the basic idea of how I play my electronic live set. It is a common concept in the jazz world for bands to play their own version of well-known jazz standards composed by people like Herbie Hancock, Duke Ellington, John Coltrane and many other big names. All of these songs have their iconic themes, and the performance process is basically always the same. The band starts playing the main theme together so that everyone in the audience gets in the mood and learns the basic idea of the piece. And then each instrumentalist gets his own solo part where he can freely improvise his own version of the main theme and show off his or her skills on stage. There is also a band leader who gives the cues to the other band members and determines the arrangement of the performance right from the gut. At the end of the performance, the entire band comes back together and plays the main theme again. Then it moves on to the next piece. So this method of jamming on stage has worked well in the jazz world for decades. I enjoyed performing with this concept a lot, so I tried to find as many translations as possible for my techno live set. This is also why I do not stick to a fixed arrangement. Instead, a track is simply a collection of drum patterns and MIDI loops that just fit well together. On the Minilogue, I have a preset that gives me a predetermined sound as a starting point, and the analog rhythm also has a pre-programmed drum pattern for each track I play. I use the titles of the MIDI clips to make some notes about the sound setting that works well for that track. For example, whether I should apply a delay, whether a sound should decay longer or shorter, or whether the ARP works well on the clip, what wavetable I'm using, and what key the track is in. And that's pretty much all I have. Just some MIDI notes, a drum pattern in the rhythm, and a preset I select in the Minilogue. I do not have any samples or VSTs in Ableton or anything that has been pre-recorded. So this means that a piece of music for me is basically just a line of MIDI clips and nothing else. This makes creating new tracks for the live performance really fast and easy, and also a lot of fun for me. I just start jamming around, find a set of melodies and a rhythm that work well together, and once I like that, I'm basically done. That's it. And then it's just a matter of practice to get a feel for the track, because I do the arrangement live on stage, just as the band leader gives cues to the band. That way I can also decide, depending on the mood of the audience, whether to take long breaks or short breaks, whether to play a little harder or softer, whether to play more melodic or more percussive parts, whether to play with long washy reverb tails or short and dry and right in the face. The cool thing is that I have my hook lines as MIDI loops, so I do not necessarily have to have a good idea on stage. It's basically a collection of awesome hook lines that I can just fire off when I want. But I'm not limited to these, because with the arpeggiator, the MIDI mutes and the keyboard, I have a lot of options to play with what I want. I can even leave the main theme completely aside. There is another nice side effect. With this approach, it is quite easy to play together with other musicians. All you have to do is use the same MIDI clock and say, hey, let's go play in A minor, and you're good to go. So for example, I play another live set together with my buddy and label partner, Rafner, who is very good at playing techno drums and percussion. In this live set he plays the drums, while I just play the melodic part. Kind of like drummer and instrumentalist in a band. Basically play with the same approach with a main theme, but no fixed arrangement, giving each other the cues only through the voice and just spontaneously as we like. It's a lot of fun to play, we have time on stage to relax for a few seconds sometimes, we can improvise as much as we want, take in the mood and decide from the gut what to do next. So I've learned a lot over the last few years about what works really well in a live set for me, and probably even more about things that turned out to be dead ends. One of the worst things that can happen is that you spend days and weeks building a live set and only realize at the very end that either it doesn't feel right, or that it's not playable at all, or that you have just not fun on stage. And all this happened to me many times because with electronic instruments, there is not just one way to make music. Instead, there are a million ways to make sounds, and it's very important to choose the techniques that work best for you and the kind of music you want to play. So in the next part, I want to share some tips and tricks that will hopefully help you make better decisions when you are building a live set. For example, what instruments to put on stage, what kind of note sequencer to use, whether to use a microphone for an acoustic instrument, and so on. When making such decisions, I would like to propose an evaluation according to 4 categories. The first category I call realness. This means that everything you do on stage should actually be live. A 100% realness rating would mean no playback, no fallback, no pre-programmed stuff. Instead, everything happens right in the moment. So playing a traditional instrument like a guitar or a violin, or simply singing on stage, for example, would be 100% real in this opinion. With electronic instruments, creating sounds is very different because sometimes you just program your device to play a certain sequence and then basically just watch it make music on its own. Also, just turning knobs doesn't feel as real and tangible as playing a traditional instrument. I try to compensate for that, for example, by doing things like detuning an oscillator live on stage, or occasionally letting a naked sawtooth shimmer through the mix because that's something that no sane music producer would probably do. But I think little effects like that sound very authentic and raw and hopefully show the audience that there is really a creative process going on stage. Alright, category number 2 is what I call the safety net. This refers to things that give you something like a safe floor in your live set, a common ground that you can come back and feel safe. Yeah. So as humans, we only have 2 hands and 1 brain, which can often feel very limiting when you have to push a lot of buttons at once and create something that sounds fantastic at the same time. It's a bit like being the conductor of an orchestra, but also having to play the instruments and do the mixdown at the same time. The easiest way to get a safe floor in your live set would be to just play back records as a DJ set rather than a live performance. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with DJing, it just shouldn't be called a live set then. Anyways, a healthy level of safety is something that at least I want to have on stage to be relaxed and therefore have fun. Playing a live set that is safe, but also real at the same time, it's not necessarily opposites. For example, if you hit a big Chinese gong on stage, it looks very real and is very real, but it is also kind of safe because the gong will always sound pretty much the same. Okay, so the third category I would like to mention, the nerd level. If you already feel that there is a little nerd living in you, or at least feel like challenging yourself from time to time is a good thing, then it can be very satisfying to do something just for the sake of doing it. It can be fun to take a certain knowledge you have acquired and put it on stage, doing something in a way that you think is the cool way. Of course, this is very much in the eye of the beholder, but it can be satisfying and fun even if the problem could possibly be solved in an easier way. For example, some artists do circuit bending live on stage, which means they take apart the electronic circuitry of an instrument while they play it. Or some people make sound with old floppy disk drives and use them as oscillators or something. So nerd choices don't always make sense in the common meaning, but they make a live set unique and outstanding, set it apart from what everyone else is doing, and most importantly, they motivate you to push the boundaries yourself. There is another fourth category that I think is super important, and I would call it rock the show. So although this may seem like a very obvious thing, it can be helpful to bring it back to your mind when you feel a little stuck in your development process. It is also very important to have a clear idea of what it means to you personally to rock a show. If you're playing ambient sounds, your goal is probably to put the whole room in a certain mood and, create an atmosphere, create an ambience. If you're playing at Gamescom, maybe it would be great to do something related to games and go on stage with a bunch of Nintendos and play sound. Or if you're playing at the X Games sports show, it might be cool to make sound with cracking bones. And if you're playing danceable music, your goal is probably to get people, dancing. The latter one is the kind of gig that I usually play, and getting people dancing with some ups and downs is also my goal for this particular live set. Coming from being a producer and a DJ, I usually play techno stages either in a club or at a festival. And with these types of venues, there is a cruel reality that applies to most of these gigs. And that is that 90% of the people have no idea what you're doing and they don't care, and that's totally fine. Then maybe 9% know what a live set is and have a rough idea of what you do. And then there are the 1% who know exactly what you do. With that in mind, the category of rocking the show becomes even more important, because if your performance sucks, it doesn't really matter how you did it. So let me give you a few examples about my decision making in this live set. For example, I decided to use pre-programmed MIDI loops. The alternative would have been to go on stage and improvise everything live, which is what actually a lot of people do. Applying my 4-category rating to this, I would say that playing pre-programmed MIDI loops provides a high level of safety net, but is not very nerdy, nor is it very real, since I just press play and let the loop loop. But when it comes to rocking the show, it's probably a good idea, because I can compose great tunes in the studio, just take the time that I need and fire off hook line after hook line when I'm performing. And I can also practice my tracks in the studio just like you practice a song on the piano. Anyway, I did not leave the improvisation part completely aside, so I decided to bring the Minilog on stage, which has a real keyboard and also some touch keys on the iPad surface for the modular voices. This way I can use the keys to play on top of the MIDI loop, and I also added buttons to mute the MIDI notes and activate a MIDI arpeggiator that varies the incoming MIDI notes, and I can change the octaves with the M4. I've also created not one but several MIDI loops for each track that I can select at any time. So with all these tools, I have quite a palette at my fingertips for additional improvisation, and would upgrade my original rating a little bit in the real category and the nerd category, so that I can live with the solution that I found. Another decision that I made was to work with Ableton and a laptop instead of just machines. Actually, until not too long ago, I was very convinced that only a non-laptop live act was the real deal, and my previous solo live set did not have a computer for that very reason. Also with this setup, I really tried to make it work with an Archive Force instead of a laptop in Ableton. The Force appeared to me as being something like Ableton in a box, which is a pretty high goal, I would say, and since I also just wanted to use a simple subset of all the things that Ableton can actually do, I thought it might work just out. But unfortunately, the Force could not fulfill the expectations that I had. Well, it does have a lot of features, but it is also full of bugs, and I found the whole structure very confusing, and there are also many limitations. On the other hand, I've been using Ableton for, I don't know, 15 years or so, and compared to my Ableton working speed, it felt very slow to do similar things with the Force. So at some point I decided to just ditch the Force and use Ableton instead. But having a laptop on stage was definitely a little bit of a downer for my personal nerd factor, but a big win for usability, and my whole process is just so much faster this way. All in all, I would give this one more point in the rock the show factor, because having more fun in the studio leads to better tracks, better performance live on stage, and also a little bit more safety net, because I really know my gear and I know what I'm doing, and it just feels a little better with working with the stuff that you know. One decision where the nerd factor won out over usability is simply the fact of using only hardware synthesizers. Even Eurorack, which also has some big drawbacks when it comes to having a secure base for live performance. With modular synthesizers, there are no presets, and that is a fact that is so deep in its nature that you just have to live with it. So once you have pulled out all the cables and turned the knobs, you will probably never be able to go back to what you had before. So that uncertainty is something that you just have to accept and take into account when you go on stage. Even though I have a fixed wiring, it still feels a little bit like the system has its own life, and it feels less static than any other hardware synthesizer that I have. But if done right, a modular synthesizer can also sound really fantastic and do stuff that would never be possible with a regular synthesizer, just since it wouldn't make sense for a manufacturer to bake the specific patch that you made into a product as a fixed circuit. To reduce the risk of accidentally turning the wrong knob, I simply stripped off some of the knobs that I do not need. This makes the raw shaft of the potentiometer look less visually inviting. I also added some nice labels to the knobs and marked some positions with little arrows when a knob has a certain home position that normally should not be changed. I've also tried to keep the modules which I really need to touch in the middle of the rack and make the top row my no touching area. But still, playing with the modular synthesizer feels like quite a downer of the safety net. To compensate for this, I did a couple of other things. The first one, I simply added a hardware synthesizer with preset functionality. Presets can be called via MIDI program change commands that I just fire off from Ableton with the scene clips, and combined with the pre-programmed MIDI loop, I get to hear a melody that pretty much always sounds the same. The analog rhythm also has such a preset feature, so with these two, the Minilogue and the rhythm, I have a fixed starting point for a new track that always sounds the same when I call it up. That takes a lot of stress off me on stage, but if I just played these predefined things, the live set would also be pretty boring, so it just buys me some time to get the modular sounds working for the new track. Okay, so far from my side. I hope you enjoyed this episode of my tutorial series, which was maybe a little different than the former ones, as it was more like a podcast-style talking head format. So I am really curious to hear your opinions, and if you have had similar or different experiences, what ways you have found to express yourself on stage, or if there are any questions you would like to ask. For all of that, please use the comment sections below, and if you enjoyed the video, do not forget to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. See you soon!